Now, today, we're going to continue our Moses series with his rescue and his adoption. This is the last of our series as far as him being a baby. Next week, we'll pick up with him being 40 years old. So I hope you cleared your schedule this morning because we got 40 years to talk about. Just kidding, just kidding. I don't want to make anyone nervous. But, you think your life is crazy? You think your life might be a mess? Moses was a basket case. Yeah. I'm sorry. I promise that there's not going to be much more of that this morning, I promise. But I saw that on a church sign on Highway 54, and, it moved me. It made me want to go to church at wherever that was. All right, but we're going to pick up Exodus chapter 2, verses 5 through 10. We're going to talk about, this is the beginning of many miracles in Moses' life, his adoption story, and the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. So that's where we're going today. But let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to read out of the ESV. I just have my NIV up here for looks, but I want you to follow along with me. Exodus chapter 2, verses 5 through 10. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Let's go ahead and look back at verse 5. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. I asked one of our resident Old Testament and Hebrew scholars, John Conrad, about this particular verse, and he let me know this would have been a Saturday. Because in North Carolina, Saturday was the one day a week that the women went to bathe. Anyhow, so daughter of Pharaoh, we pick up right away. Ding, ding, ding. This is an important person. This is the daughter of the genocidal leader that we talked about from Exodus 1. This guy he had been in charge of the senseless murder of all of these young Hebrew boys. This is his daughter. This is a member of the royal household. This is basically a princess. She's kind of a big deal. She saw the basket among the reeds. Reese mentioned last week this, and I'm going to mention it again. The word for basket here is mentioned 28 times. It's the same word that's mentioned 28 times for Noah's Ark in Genesis chapter 6. Clearly, this basket, this little ark, this basket boat, was intended to be a means of conveying the young child to safety from threatening catastrophe. And who can doubt that it was constructed, watch this, it was constructed with a mother's prayers, that it would provide as effective deliverance as Noah's Ark had. Can you imagine what was going through Moses' mom's mind as she was weaving that basket together? The prayers that she was praying, the tears that she shed, not knowing what would happen as she was putting that basket boat together. It would be a fascinating study to take all across Scripture, all of the ladies, all of the moms, all of the women who prayed for refuge, who prayed for rescue, who prayed for a son, prayed for a daughter, prayed for healing. I'm sure there's studies out there, but it would be incredible to just take a look at all of those. And all of those mothers who prayed. Maybe you're here today and you've been praying for a son, praying for a daughter. Maybe they're grown, maybe it's a grown son or grown daughter, and you've been praying for a long time. I want to encourage you today that God hears you. God hears every single one of those prayers, and God is moving and answering those prayers, whether or not you've seen it in the physical realm or not yet. God has great plans for you today. God is orchestrating every single event and thing that happens in your life for His glory and for His purposes. So while we're talking about a mother's prayers, I want to tell you a story about an early 20th century missionary, a guy named James O. Fraser. He was a missionary to the Li Sioux people of China. And he basically attributed his entire missionary life, every success he saw, everything that happened, to the depth of his mother's prayers for him. At the age of 21, James O. Fraser applied to serve with the China Inland Mission. Now it's called the Overseas Missionary Fellowship. And he was accepted. At the headquarters, he came to full agreement with the principles of the mission, to work on interdenominational lines without stated salary, avoiding debt in any form, and making no appeals for money. His parents heartily consented to his decision. His praying mom could say, "I could not pour the ointment on Jesus' blessed feet as Mary did, but I gave him my boy." A deepened fellowship developed between James and his mother. The loneliness James's mother felt as he left was a willing sacrifice for Jesus' sake, and was he not worthy of it? Wow. I was thinking, my mom's here today, Miss June, and there's been a lot of prayers in my life, and I probably should have tucked my shirt in and worn a jacket today. Sorry, Mom. But Reese gave me a book. When we did the 3 days of prayer and fasting a couple of weeks ago, he gave me this book called Dirty Glory. And it's by this guy named Pete Greig. He's from the UK. And he started this 24/7 prayer network, this movement in 1999. Well, he would say God started it, which would be the accurate thing to say. God started through him this prayer movement. And he wrote this book about the things that he's learned about prayer. And this quote in here stunned me, partly because of its simplicity, but partly because of the truth of it. The greatest answer to prayer is prayer itself. It's easy for God to perform miracles, rare for us to truly humble ourselves and ask. Let's keep going. Verse 7. Then his sister, Moses' sister, said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Here again, we pick up with three important ladies. We've got Moses' mother, Jochebed was her name, Pharaoh's daughter, the Egyptian princess, and Moses' sister, Miriam. I was amazed looking at this, at Moses' sister. We see God moving in her life. She comes back later in Exodus. But she was only probably between the ages of 8 and 12 years old. She probably spoke Egyptian to communicate with the princess because they had been in captivity for so many years. How bold was she, though, to speak to the princess? "Hey, I know a nurse. My mom, I know a nurse." And can you imagine her watching and waiting, knowing where the basket that her baby brother was in? Can you imagine what would go through a 12-year-old girl's mind? Wanting to just go and rescue the baby and waiting for the right moment to speak. Verse 9, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. Here we see the pain of Moses' mother having to give him up in the basket. We see that pain being healed. And now she's going to be paid to raise him. How good is God? That's unbelievable. So she receives her son that she had just given up, and she's going to be paid by the royal household to raise him. And it would probably be about the time that Moses was 10 years old that he'd be given back to the palace, because technically, from the moment she was being paid, he had been already legally adopted. So he was already the daughter, or the son of Pharaoh's daughter at that point. But Moses' mom had the gift of receiving him again to raise him. It's powerful. It's a powerful story of Moses' discovery and his getting adopted. Now, Moses' mother essentially had to give him up 2 times. First with the basket, and then again when he was 10 years old, back to the palace. You know, you can even imagine, I imagine Moses' adopted mother, Pharaoh's daughter, telling him the story over and over, many times, of his rescue, his adoption story. And I also imagine Moses' birth mother and his sister telling him the story from their perspective as well, many times. Remember, you were in that basket, and just telling him. Moses' mom first delivered the future deliverer, released the deliverer in the river. Pharaoh's daughter rescued the deliverer, and with the help of Moses' sister, returned the deliverer. Moses' mom then raised the deliverer, then released him again to return to Pharaoh's daughter. And all that happened in such a short period of time. Verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Now, there's so much imagery and parallel here. There's foreshadowing of the things to come, because the name of Moses in the Egyptian language and in the Hebrew language had great significance. It meant son, and it meant to be drawn out, kind of showing that this is the son that God's going to draw out of the water in the Red Sea later on. And this is the one who would deliver God's people, the Israelites, from the Egyptian slavery. Now, when I got the opportunity, when Reese first talked to me about preaching and gave me this specific passage, I've got a lot of guys, other staff guys who are really rooting for me and sending me commentaries, texting me, sending me photocopied pictures of things that would be helpful, and I really appreciate that. So Tim sent me one, and I want to read this because this is a great summary of the life of Moses, and it's by this guy. He's got like a Lord of the Rings type name, Dr. I.M. Haldeman. So I want to read this to you. The life of Moses presents a series of striking antitheses. He was the child of a slave and the son of a queen. He was born in a hut and lived in a palace. He inherited poverty and enjoyed unlimited wealth. He was the leader of armies and the keeper of flocks. He was the mightiest of warriors and the meekest of men. He was educated in the court and dwelt in the desert. He had the wisdom of Egypt and the faith of a child. He was fitted for the city and wandered in the wilderness. He was tempted with the pleasures of sin and endured the hardships of virtue. He was backwards in speech and talked with God. He had the rod of a shepherd and the power of the infinite. He was a fugitive from Pharaoh and an ambassador from heaven. He was the giver of the law and the forerunner of grace. He died alone on Mount Moab and appeared with Christ in Judea. No man assisted at his funeral, yet God buried him. So over and over we'll see as we continue this series on Moses, miraculous thing happening, one thing after another, miracles, miracles, miracles. And that is who we serve. That is the God we serve. He does miracles today in our life. He brought us here today for a purpose. So first thing we want to look at is to trust God's sovereignty. His sovereign hand is working all the time. In Moses' life, this is a beautiful weaving miracle of God, the salvation ultimately of the Jewish people. And again, this is hopes of God's plan in a baby. That sounds familiar, right? Pharaoh's daughter's heart was moved with compassion rather than to do what her father had decreed and let the baby die. She was moved with compassion and wanted to rescue him, the heart of adoption. She was the daughter of the enemy. God thwarts the plans of the enemy using the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Now, God's sovereignty is also mysterious. There's this misconception out there is the more that we get to know God, the more knowledge of God that we have, his mystery goes down. The more we know about God, the more we okay, this is what he's going to do. I can get ahead of him a little bit now. No, it's actually the opposite of that. The more that we get to know God, the more our knowledge of God grows, his mystery goes up, right? Yeah. It's like that old saying, the more we get to know God, the more we find how little we know compared to God. We can take comfort in God's provision. He has different timing than ours. He orchestrates all things for his grand plans and purposes. In this story, it's the beauty of God's providential care, not only in Moses' life, but in our life as well. Now if you think about, there's not enough time today to talk about God's sovereignty. That'd be like a 90-week series, and we get someone way more educated to talk about it. But in all of God's sovereignty, how he planned things, past, present, and future, outside of time, how he orchestrates all things and predestines all things. It's there in Ephesians 1. He still allows for your prayers and my prayers to change things. So I put a mind-blowing emoji up there because that's that's the reality of it. It's like, so everything God has planned to ever happen for each one of our lives, there's also this allowance that he's made in his sovereignty for whether or not you and I decide to pray about any one single circumstance. I know. Here's C.S. Lewis on miracles and sovereignty. Each miracle writes for us in small letters something that God has already written, in letters almost too large to be noticed across the whole canvas of nature. I'm going to leave that up for a second because I had to read it about 400 times before I began to understand what he was saying. But basically, the miracles that we see with our frail human eyes, God has already worked out and orchestrated and planned a greater, grander purpose that we can't even see, we can't even understand. Yet he is that good of a God. So we can trust God's sovereignty. We should trust God's sovereignty. I implore you to trust God's sovereignty. Secondly, don't underestimate what God will do with your sacrifice. One act of obedience can change everything. How many of you, that's been true in your life already? One time you obeyed God and it changed everything in your life. Yes. We see that in Hebrews 10. By one single sacrifice, Jesus Christ has made perfect forever those who are being sanctified. That's good news. Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins and my sins once for all and rose from the grave and abolished any sin we'd ever commit, past, present, and future. And we live for the joy that we have in him because of one single sacrifice. We no longer have to go and slaughter a lamb. The perfect, sinless, spotless lamb, the Son of God, was slaughtered in our place. Amen? We also see sacrifices, doing the right thing is sometimes inconvenient. It was certainly inconvenient for Moses' mom and Moses' sister and even Pharaoh's daughter. They all risked their lives one way or another in this story to allow for Moses, the deliverer, to be preserved. Adoption stories are beautiful. And I thank God that we're in a fellowship where many have experienced this rescue of the fatherless. We believe in the gift and the glory of adoption. It's God's gift. That's God's design. Thirdly, be an unsung hero. We all have opportunities every day to be an unsung hero. To not necessarily do the humble brag on the internet like, oh, I'm downtown, I'm serving in the soup kitchen, selfie with a homeless person. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes we get a little carried away. But we can be unsung heroes. You know, Moses' mom, she didn't make it into the coloring book, you know? She didn't make it into the Old Testament character coloring book for the kids. She was an unsung hero. She did what was right even though it was inconvenient. Pharaoh's daughter, I would argue, is an unsung hero, risking her life to spare a Hebrew child. Moses' sister Miriam, definitely an unsung hero. I want to encourage you today, we all have a unique story. We have all been gifted by God to do specific things for His glory. Martin Luther King said, we can't all be famous, but we can all do great things. I think there's a spiritual aspect to that too. We may not necessarily get the praise of men for something we do for God, but we should do it anyway. Because God is good, and He sees and He knows. So, I want to tell you one more story, and I hope this rounds out the day, and I hope it blesses you, because it certainly has blessed me greatly. And I hope you see the goodness of God in this. In the 1940s, there was a young lady named Mary Joyce Presley. You'll see her picture on the screen. And we can leave her picture up for a while. She was the oldest of 9 children. She was born in Talladega, Alabama, Ricky Bobby country. So she was the oldest of 9 children, and she had an incredibly physically abusive father. He was so abusive, especially to the older children. So Miss Mary married at 17, very young, to a man named William Roberts, partly to get away from that abusive situation at home. She got a job working at the textile factory. She couldn't dream of buying a car. She couldn't afford it. So she had to get a taxi to work. Now, over time, she had taken different taxi rides, and there was a taxi driver named James Alexander King, Jimmy King, that took Miss Mary, who's now Miss Mary Roberts, to work. And before too long, there was an extramarital affair, because Mr. Jimmy King, the taxi driver, was also married. There was an affair and an unplanned pregnancy. So you got Miss Mary and William Roberts, you got Jimmy King and his wife Beatrice, and then the two, Jimmy and Mary, had an extramarital affair and an unplanned pregnancy. Now, we've all been following what's going on in the news lately. Modern man's wisdom would be, oh, you're too young, you can't afford it, this baby's an inconvenience, especially an unplanned pregnancy, extramarital affair, there's nothing going good for you. This would be a great candidate in our modern man's wisdom for an abortion. But she did not do that. She went to the Salvation Army maternity home in Birmingham, Alabama, and had a little boy named Robert Keith Roberts. It's a very Welsh name. And at 2 weeks old, she gave him up to the Salvation Army home, the Salvation Army orphanage in Birmingham. Now, why am I telling you this story? Why is this important? Well, that baby, Robert Keith Roberts, is my dad. And there was a couple that you'll see on the screen. Lucius and Mary Lou. Lou and Mary Lou, yeah. Lucius and Mary Lou Huff came along and had desired to have a baby. And 4 months old, my dad, Robert Keith Roberts, was adopted and given a new name, David Huff. David meaning beloved. And they had longed to love a child, and they had the opportunity. Now, my dad grew up with them. There's some pictures of my dad. He's got a fish there. And I don't know if that's a school photo or I don't know what that other one, maybe prom or something. But without adoption, without doing the right thing even though it was inconvenient, my dad would have never been born, especially in our modern day. And I wouldn't be here, obviously. But I'm so thankful that Miss Mary decided to have the baby. Now, the couple you saw, Mary Lou and Lucius Huff, had offered my dad for a long time, if you're ever interested in wanting to find out who your birth parents are, we can help you. And my dad was just never interested. Until in 1990, in 1979, his adopted father passed away, and then in 1990, his adopted mom passed away, and then he began the search for his birth parents. And in 1992, he got a call from the records place, in the state records in Alabama, that they had located his birth mother in California. So in August of 1992, my dad called up California and got a lady on the other end of the line who was his birth mother. And it was the sweetest conversation you could ever imagine possibly having. So in about 3 days, he got on an airplane and flew. They had arranged for her to be holding a red rose at the airport. And they spent several days together. My dad found out he had 2 half-sisters, and his birth mother found out she had 4 grandchildren, one of them which was me. And there was a story done in the AJC about it. My dad was about as old as I am now when this happened. Moses was reunited with his birth mother by God's orchestrating and God's design. My father was reunited with his birth mother. And recently, my dad got to tell his testimony for his church, and his birth mother got to be right on the front row. It's cool, yeah. But maybe you're here today and you say, well, John, that's a nice story. That's a great story. That's nice and all. But you don't know what I'm going through today. You don't know my circumstances. You don't know my affliction, my pain. You don't know what suffering I'm going through with sickness or with a family member. And you're right. I may not know that. But I want to encourage you today. Jesus Christ has guaranteed your exodus. I want to read something to you. This is called God Knows. It's by a man named John Bloom. The reality expressed in the words God knows is a well of profound comfort and peace for us in our afflictions. Yes, there remain unanswered questions. No, they do not themselves remove our pain. But in Exodus 2 and Genesis 15, we see why these words are pregnant with hope. Your affliction has a purpose. You likely don't know what it is yet, but someday you will. And your affliction has a timeline. You likely don't know what it is yet, and likely it already seems too long. But someday you will understand. And you will understand that the purposes for both your affliction and how long you were required to endure it extended far beyond the range of your perception. And then it will make sense. Jesus Christ has guaranteed your exodus, and it is a far greater exodus than the mere escape from your affliction. There is coming an end to your sojourning in this foreign land. There is a promised land far greater than Canaan. And when you reach it, no matter what you suffered in this vale of tears, you will have no regrets. God will have worked it all for such good that you will wonder that you ever questioned his judgment or goodness. In your affliction, cry out to God for help. He hears. And when the time is right, God will answer you. For God sees you, and he knows.